I know I was already a Carrara simp before, but seeing their technique in action has really left me starstruck. Greetings from the far side of the galaxy, I'm Fury, your host with the most, here to bring you a story about ghosts. Cursed spirits technically, but they're basically the same thing. Why don't you do the like, comment, and subscribe thing that every other YouTuber tells you to do while I go ahead and dive right on into today's chapter. Jujutsu Kaisen Chapter 156, Twinkling Stars. Our chapter begins with Megumi making note of the stars Kirara's technique left on Rabbit Escape. After a bit of collaborating with Panda, he realizes that only certain markings are being pulled towards each other, namely the rabbits avoided everything else but could move towards the second floor. Megumi uses his knowledge of the star markings and their names to come to a single conclusion. Kirara's technique is based off the constellation the Southern Cross. Side note, I just love how there's this running gag of everyone finding Rabbit Escape cute as hell. I do find it neat that what gave it away was Kirara's reaction. Usually that's for the audience to tell the character guessed right, but it's nice to see it practically used inside the story. And further logical deduction from Megumi lead him to presume that Kirara's technique counts herself, meaning there's actually 5 points in this cross. And due to him now being able to move towards Panda, Megumi realizes that there's a certain order that must be observed when moving from point to point on the cross. And Megumi infers that the order that must be progressed is based on the depth between each star in the constellation and the Earth. Honestly, I think Kirara's technique borders a middle ground between being bad for a protagonist and good for an antagonist. It's good for an antagonist because it forces the protagonist to slow down and think about what they're going to do next with problem solving. It can also be used very creatively, like when Kirara marks a card to throw it at Panda to create dynamic action scenes. However, the complexity also makes the technique so complicated that it might make fights confusing later on, especially when multiple techniques are thrown into the mix. I mean, look at Gojo's limitless technique for example. People still don't understand how that color mixing nonsense works. And I'm sure Kirara is going to confuse a lot of people too. So let me give a brief rundown of how Kirara's technique works, or how I think it does. First off, its name is Love Rendezvous. Kirara uses cursed energy to mark 5 separate points. Those with 2 identical points will move towards each other while being repelled from the others. The only way to get around this repulsion effect is to move from mark to mark based on the depth of each point relative to the Earth. Boom, done. There's your explanation for that technique that will hopefully not become outdated when Kirara shows off something new in the next battle or next chapter, knowing my luck. Back in the chapter, Megumi uses this knowledge to slowly progress up the star chain so he can reach Kirara. He even takes advantage of the fact that his divine dog is marked, using it to sandwich Kirara between the divine dog and himself. Honestly, it kinda reminds me of the Bastet fight from Stardust Crusaders. All we need is for Panda to say some English and we'll be good. Unlike, what was her name again? Mariah? Well, unlike Mariah, Kirara doesn't get crushed. Instead, Megumi locks them in a chokehold and asks them to listen to what they have to say. And the chapter ends before we can hear Kirara's answer. All in all, it wasn't a bad chapter. We get to know Kirara's technique and its weaknesses, that being how it's relatively simple to counter once you figure it out. In that regard, it reminds me of that damage nullification technique that the one guy from the Shibuya arc had. The only downside to this chapter is that it's relatively light on story progression, leaving me without much to talk about. I give the chapter a 7 out of 10. Nothing glamorous, but it's still pretty good. Since we finished the fight with Kirara, the next chapter might flip back to Yuji battling Akari before Kirara and Megumi interject and we learn what they talked about. It's a common writing tactic since conversations tend to be boring. Regardless of whether or not I'm right or probably wrong, I'll be sure to stick around and review it. Why don't you do that like and subscribe thing since I got videos about No More Heroes 3 and Neo the World Ends With You in production. Like always, this is your host Fury, signing out.